The countryside sprawled out before them, a patchwork of lush greens and golden fields. The winding road seemed to stretch forever, guiding the small group of friends toward their much-needed escape. The car's tires crunched on the gravel driveway as they approached their destination. A large, weathered house perched on the edge of a dense forest. It stood tall and imposing, its faded white paint peeling in long strips, revealing gray wood beneath. The windows were narrow and dark, framed by crooked shutters, giving the place an air of mystery. Wild ivy climbed up the side of the house, as if nature itself were trying to reclaim it. Ellie, the group's planner and perpetual optimist, grinned as the GPS announced their arrival. A petite woman with chestnut-brown hair tied in a loose ponytail, Ellie had a knack for finding unique travel spots. She wore a bright yellow sundress, her favorite leather satchel slung across one shoulder. Her enthusiasm was infectious, though her friends often joked that her love for the unconventional bordered on reckless. "This is it," she said, pointing to the house. The Airbnb listing had promised charming seclusion and a cozy retreat. To Ellie, it looked like the perfect weekend getaway. The others weren't so sure. Nathan, always skeptical, leaned against the car with his arms crossed. His tall frame and sharp features made him look older than his 28 years, and his constant frown added to his air of perpetual suspicion. He adjusted his dark-rimmed glasses and raised an eyebrow as he surveyed the house. "Looks like the set of a horror movie," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "Come on," Ellie laughed. "It's rustic." Behind him, Lisa and Ryan exchanged amused glances. Lisa, a self-proclaimed scaredy cat, shivered as she stepped out of the car. Her long auburn hair cascaded down her back, and her hazel eyes darted nervously between the house and the surrounding forest. She wore a simple green sweater and jeans, but even her casual attire couldn't hide her unease. "Rustic or not, this place gives me the creeps," she murmured, hugging herself against the slight chill in the air. Ryan, always the joker, slung an arm around her shoulders. His sandy blonde hair was perpetually messy, and his bright blue eyes sparkled with mischief. Dressed in a faded hoodie and cargo shorts, he looked more like a college student on spring break than a young professional. "Don't worry, Lise. If there are ghosts, I'll protect you," he teased, giving her a playful nudge. The group hauled their luggage inside, their voices echoing in the cavernous entryway. The interior of the house was as aged as its exterior. The hardwood floors were scuffed and uneven, and the faint smell of dust lingered in the air. A creaky staircase led to the bedrooms upstairs, and the living room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Above the mantel hung a faded painting of a pastoral scene, the colors muted with age. "Okay, I'll admit it," Nathan said, setting his bag down. "It's got character." Ellie beamed. "See? I told you it would be great." The kitchen was modest but functional, with dated appliances and mismatched cabinets. A wooden dining table sat in the corner, its surface scarred with years of use. Through the back window, they could see a small, overgrown garden and a rickety shed leaning precariously to one side. Everything seemed fine until they stumbled upon the basement door. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, almost hidden from view. The door was padlocked, a heavy chain looping through the handle. A weathered sign hung from it, the words crudely painted in red, "Do not enter." "That's not ominous at all," Nathan said, crouching to inspect the lock. "I bet it's just where they store cleaning supplies or something." "Or bodies," Ryan quipped, wiggling his eyebrows for dramatic effect. Ellie rolled her eyes. They probably just don't want guests poking around. Let's leave it alone and enjoy the weekend, okay? Lisa hesitated, her gaze lingering on the door. You're right. Let's just stay upstairs. But even as they unpacked and settled in, the locked doors seemed to loom in the back of everyone's mind. The forest outside was a dark sea of trees, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. A narrow dirt trail wound its way into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. The setting sun cast long, slanted rays through the trees, painting the scene in shades of gold and crimson. As the group settled into their rooms, the house groaned and creaked, the sounds of its age amplified in the quiet. Ellie's room was small but cozy, with a quilted bedspread and a window that looked out over the garden. Nathan's room was sparsely furnished, its only decorations a pair of faded floral curtains and a mirror with a tarnished frame. Lisa and Ryan shared the largest room, which had a four-poster bed draped with gauzy white fabric that swayed gently in the draft. Despite the house's rustic charm, an undercurrent of unease lingered. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though whenever she turned around, there was nothing there. Nathan kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, only to find the shadows playing tricks on him. Even Ellie, usually unfazed by such things, found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the house was shrouded in darkness. The forest outside seemed to close in, the sounds of nocturnal creatures filling the air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its mournful cry echoing through the night. The group gathered in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. "It's just us and nature," Ellie said, trying to lighten the mood. "Let's enjoy it while we can." But as they sat there, the padlocked basement door lingered in their thoughts, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What was down there, and why had it been locked away? Dinner was a lively affair. They grilled steaks on the porch, the scent of charred meat mingling with the crisp evening air. The porch overlooked the untamed garden, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. Ellie had set up a small table with candles and flowers she had picked earlier from the overgrown bushes. Despite the eerie charm of the house, they managed to relax, their laughter echoing across the quiet countryside. The sky darkened as they lingered, talking and sipping wine. The stars emerged, bright and countless in the absence of city lights. Nathan, who had been quiet for most of the evening, leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the forest. "Have you guys noticed how quiet it is?" he asked. "Like, no crickets, no frogs, just silence." Lisa shivered, rubbing her arms. "I thought I was imagining it." Ryan waved dismissively. "It's peaceful. You're both just city kids who don't know how to handle the countryside." Still, the group finished their meal quickly, the atmosphere shifting. Inside, the house felt colder, the flickering glow of the fireplace the only source of warmth. They gathered in the living room for a board game, trying to shake off the unease. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, glancing toward the hallway. "Hear what?" Ryan asked, pausing mid-turn. "It sounded like whispering," she said, her voice barely audible. Nathan frowned, setting his cards down. "Probably the wind." Ellie forced a laugh. "This place is old. Houses like this creak and groan all the time." But the mood had shifted. They played for another hour, though their earlier excitement was gone. Eventually, Ellie suggested calling it a night. The group climbed the creaky stairs to their rooms, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Nathan lingered behind, his eyes fixed on the basement door. The padlock was secure, the chain unmoved, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Finally, he shook his head and headed upstairs. The house was silent, except for the occasional groan of wood. Lisa lay awake, staring at the ceiling as faint sounds drifted up from below. It wasn't just creaking. There was a rhythm to it, like footsteps pacing back and forth. "Ryan," she whispered, nudging him. "Do you hear that?" Ryan stirred, mumbling something incoherent before rolling over. Lisa's heart pounded as the sounds grew louder. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to fall asleep. But sleep wouldn't come, not when the whispers began again, faint but unmistakable, as though someone, or something, was just outside the door. The morning brought an eerie stillness to the house. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Ellie woke to the smell of coffee brewing and padded down to the kitchen, her yellow slippers scuffing against the floorboards. She found Nathan standing by the counter, staring blankly out the window at the garden beyond. "Morning," Ellie said, her voice bright despite the unease lingering from the previous night. "Where's Lisa and Ryan?" Nathan turned to her, his expression unusually grim. "Lisa's upstairs. Ryan, I don't know. I haven't seen him." Ellie frowned. "He's probably just outside. You know how he loves to explore." But when an hour passed and Ryan hadn't returned, the mood shifted. Lisa joined them in the living room, her face pale and drawn. "He wasn't in our room when I woke up," she admitted. "I thought he came down here." Nathan's gaze flicked toward the basement door. "What if he—" Lisa shook her head vehemently. "No, he wouldn't have gone down there. He hates stuff like that." Still, they couldn't ignore the possibility. The three of them approached the door, the padlock still firmly in place. Nathan crouched to inspect it, running his fingers over the cold metal. "It hasn't been opened," he said, his voice hollow. "Then where is he?" Ellie asked, her voice cracking. The three of them searched the house, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The upstairs bedrooms were undisturbed, their belongings untouched. The garden and shed revealed nothing but overgrown weeds and rusted tools. By midday, the tension was palpable, each of them too afraid to voice their growing fears. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room, Nathan spoke up. "We should call someone. The police, maybe." Ellie nodded. "I'll do it." She grabbed her phone, but when she tried to dial, the call wouldn't go through. "No signal," she muttered, holding the phone up as if it would help. Lisa tried hers with the same result. "This can't be happening," she whispered. The hours dragged on, the house growing darker as night fell. They locked the doors and huddled together in the living room, their earlier bravado gone. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the shutters. Inside, the house seemed to creak more than usual, the noises setting their nerves on edge. And then they heard it, a faint thudding sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below. Ellie froze, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Nathan nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from the basement." Lisa clutched a blanket to her chest, her breathing shallow. "It can't be. The padlock, it's still there. The sound grew louder, a steady thud, 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 as if someone, or something, was knocking from the other side of the door. None of them moved, too terrified to investigate. And then it stopped. Silence fell over the house, heavy and oppressive. They sat there, frozen, until Ellie finally broke the silence. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "We need to leave. Now." But when they tried the front door, it wouldn't budge. The handle wouldn't turn, as if it had been locked from the outside. The windows, too, were stuck, the glass unyielding no matter how hard they pushed. "We're trapped," Lisa whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nathan grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. "If we can't leave, we have to figure out what's going on. We need to check the basement." Ellie grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We don't know what's down there." "Exactly," Nathan said, his voice steely. "We don't know, and we won't until we look." Reluctantly, Ellie and Lisa followed him to the basement door. The padlock glinted in the beam of Nathan's flashlight, untouched. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, an almost tangible presence pressing down on them. Nathan hesitated, then shook his head. "We need to break it open." Lisa backed away. "No, I can't. I can't do this." Ellie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. Together." Nathan found a crowbar in the shed, and with a few hard strikes, the padlock snapped open. The chain clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the silent house. Nathan pushed the door open, revealing a set of wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. Nathan flicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. Ellie and Lisa followed him down, their footsteps creaking on the rickety stairs. The basement was larger than they expected, the walls lined with shelves holding jars filled with unidentifiable contents. The light reflected off the glass, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. In the far corner, something moved. A figure stepped out of the darkness, its face obscured. Nathan's flashlight beam landed on it, and they all gasped. It was Ryan. But something was wrong. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and waxy. He tilted his head, his movements jerky and unnatural. And then he smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent shivers down their spines. "What the?" Nathan began, but Ryan lunged toward them, his movements too fast to be human. "Run!" Ellie screamed, grabbing Lisa's arm. They bolted up the stairs, the sound of Ryan's footsteps pounding behind them. They slammed the door shut and shoved the couch against it, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. Then the knocking began again, more insistent this time, as if whatever was down there wasn't done with them yet. By the third night, the atmosphere in the house had become unbearable. The once cozy rooms seemed oppressive, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the dim light. The air was heavy, charged with an unexplainable tension that made it hard to breathe. Ellie, Nathan, and Lisa sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling weakly, offering little comfort. "We have to leave," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay another night." "We've tried," Nathan replied, his frustration evident. "The doors won't open, the windows won't budge, and there's no signal. We're trapped here until someone finds us." "But what if no one does?" Ellie whispered, her eyes darting toward the basement door. It loomed in the corner like a dark sentinel, a constant reminder of the horrors below. As if on cue, the noises began again. Faint at first, barely discernible over the crackle of the fire, but growing louder and more deliberate. It started with a low scratching, like nails dragging across wood, followed by a rhythmic tapping. Thud, thud, thud. Ellie clutched her knees to her chest, her breath quickening. It's coming from the basement. No, Lisa whispered, shaking her head. It's not. It's closer. Nathan grabbed the flashlight, his jaw set. Stay here. I'll check it out. You're not going alone, Ellie said, standing up. If you're going, I'm going too. Lisa hesitated, her fear evident, but she nodded. I'm not staying here by myself. They moved cautiously through the house, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The noises grew louder as they approached the kitchen, a steady pounding that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The air was icy cold, their breaths visible in the dim light. In the kitchen, the source of the noise became clear. The refrigerator door was rattling violently, its handle jerking as if someone, or something, was trying to open it. Nathan stepped forward, gripping the flashlight tightly. Stay back, he warned. He reached out, his hand trembling, and yanked the door open. The rattling stopped instantly, leaving only silence. The fridge was empty, its interior dark and cold. But as they stared, a deep, guttural growl emanated from somewhere behind them. They turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, and for a moment they thought they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that sent chills down their spines. Run, Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. They bolted back to the living room, slamming the door behind them. The growling followed, low and menacing, growing louder with each passing. By the fourth night, Ellie was gone. She'd been in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, when Nathan and Lisa heard her scream. By the time they reached her, the room was empty. The only sound was the faint click of the basement lock, as if it had just been opened and closed. Nathan's flashlight cut a sharp beam through the kitchen, revealing nothing but the stillness of the dimly lit room. The back door was bolted shut, the windows intact, and yet Ellie had vanished. That's it, Nathan said, his voice shaking but firm. He grabbed the flashlight with one hand and a wrench from the counter with the other. I'm going down there. Are you insane? Lisa cried, clutching her own arms. Her pale face was framed by trembling hair. We need to wait for help. Nathan shot her a grim look. Help isn't coming, not in time. Whatever's down there, he gestured toward the basement. It's taking us one by one. I'm not waiting for it to come for us. Lisa faltered, then nodded reluctantly, her face a mixture of terror and resolve. She opened a drawer and pulled out a kitchen knife, her knuckles white as she gripped it. I'm not letting you go alone. Together, they approached the basement door, its ominous chain still glinting under the flashlight's beam. They pried the padlock open with a crowbar Nathan had retrieved from the shed earlier, the chain clattering loudly as it fell to the floor. The door creaked open, revealing a yawning black void that reeked of mildew and something far worse, something rotten. The wooden stairs were narrow and uneven, their groans amplified by the suffocating silence around them. The air grew colder with each step, as if the basement was swallowing them whole. Nathan's flashlight illuminated the walls, lined with flaking plaster and rusted pipes that dripped occasionally into puddles on the ground. Shadows danced wildly in the wavering light, giving the space an eerie, pulsating life of its own. When they reached the bottom, the room opened into a large, cavernous space. The ceiling was low, supported by wooden beams that looked dangerously close to collapsing. Shelves lined the walls, their contents illuminated sporadically by the flashlight beam. Rows of jars filled with murky liquid glinted faintly, their contents unrecognizable yet grotesque. Twisted forms suspended in stasis, as if they were specimens from some horrifying experiment. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Her breath misted in the frigid air. Nathan didn't answer. His flashlight had caught something at the far end of the room, a figure standing motionless, partially obscured by shadows. He raised the light higher, and the beam landed on its face. Hollow eyes stared back, set into a face that was disturbingly familiar. "Ellie?" Nathan breathed, his voice cracking. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. As the light illuminated her fully, it became clear that this wasn't Ellie. Not anymore. Her skin was pallid, her features contorted into a grotesque mockery of her former self. Her mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, her teeth stained and sharp. Lisa screamed, the sound echoing off the damp walls, and Ellie, or whatever she had become, lunged toward them with an inhuman shriek. Nathan swung the wrench instinctively, striking her shoulder. The force of the blow sent her staggering back, but it barely slowed her down. "Run!" Nathan shouted, grabbing Lisa's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. They scrambled upward, their footsteps pounding against the wood as the sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. They burst into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind them and jamming the crowbar through the handle as a makeshift lock. For a moment, there was silence, save for their ragged breathing. Then the pounding began. Heavy, deliberate thuds against the other side of the door, shaking the frame with each impact. "We need to get out of here," Lisa gasped, tears streaming down her face. "We can't fight that thing." Nathan nodded, his mind racing. "The car. If we can make it to the car, maybe..." The pounding stopped. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the noise. They exchanged a glance, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, they heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from every direction at once. The growl lingered in the air, vibrating through the walls like a primal force. Nathan tightened his grip on the wrench, his knuckles white. "It's close," he whispered. Lisa's eyes darted toward the windows. The glass was fogged from their panicked breaths, but no movement stirred beyond. "We have to go now," she said, her voice trembling. Nathan shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Whatever this is, it's hunting us." From the depths of the house came a sudden crash, loud enough to rattle the dishes in the kitchen cabinets. It was followed by the sound of something scraping, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. Lisa flinched, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The lights flickered, plunging the room into near darkness before returning with a dim, sickly glow. Nathan swung the flashlight beam toward the hallway. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, pooling in corners where light should have reached. "Where's it coming from?" Lisa whispered, clutching the knife so tightly her hand shook. Nathan hesitated, his breathing shallow. The basement. It has to be. Before they could act, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Each step made the floorboards creak, sending a jolt of fear through them both. The footsteps stopped just beyond the kitchen doorway. Nathan raised the flashlight, its beam trembling as it illuminated the darkened corridor. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on them as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Ellie, or what was left of her. Her head tilted unnaturally, her hollow eyes fixed on them as her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Nathan," she rasped, her voice distorted and guttural. "Stay back," Nathan shouted, swinging the wrench in front of him. His voice echoed off the walls, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Lisa let out a choked sob as she backed away. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." The creature lunged, its speed unnatural and terrifying. Nathan swung the wrench, connecting with its arm with a sickening crunch, but it barely slowed. The force of the impact sent him stumbling backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor. "Lisa, run!" he yelled. Lisa hesitated for only a moment before bolting toward the living room. Nathan followed, the creature's guttural growls growing louder behind them. They reached the front door, tugging desperately at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock seemed fused, unyielding despite their frantic efforts. "Help me move this," Nathan shouted, grabbing a nearby chair. Together, they shoved furniture against the doorway, creating a makeshift barricade. The creature's pounding began almost immediately, each impact shaking the fragile barrier. "This won't hold," Lisa gasped, her voice breaking. "What do we do?" Nathan scanned the room, his mind racing. His eyes landed on the fireplace, its embers glowing faintly. "The tunnel," he said suddenly. "There's always a tunnel or something behind the fireplace in places like this." Lisa stared at him, wide-eyed. "You can't be serious." "It's worth a shot," Nathan said. He grabbed the poker from the hearth and began prodding at the bricks. Lisa joined him, her knife abandoned in favor of prying loose a stone. To their astonishment, one of the bricks shifted, revealing a narrow opening behind the fireplace. The pounding grew louder, the creature's snarls filling the air. "Go," Nathan urged, pushing Lisa toward the opening. She crawled through, her breath coming in short gasps as the darkness swallowed her. Nathan followed, pulling the brick back into place just as the barricade behind them gave way. The tunnel was cramped and suffocating, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Their knees scraped against the rough ground as they crawled forward, the only light coming from Nathan's dim flashlight. The sound of the creature's growls faded, replaced by an eerie silence. "Where does this lead?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Nathan admitted, "but it's better than staying back there." The tunnel sloped downward, the walls narrowing until they could barely move. Just as panic began to set in, the space opened into a cavernous room. The ceiling was high, supported by ancient wooden beams that creaked ominously. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what looked like old blood. Lisa recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is this place?" Nathan approached the altar cautiously, his flashlight revealing strange symbols carved into the stone. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the room itself was alive with malice. Before they could investigate further, a sound echoed through the cavern. A low, guttural growl, louder than anything they'd heard before. Nathan turned, his flashlight landing on the far corner of the room. The creature was there, its twisted form illuminated in the flickering light. It was larger now, its features grotesquely distorted. Its hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light as it advanced, its movements deliberate and predatory. "This is it," Nathan said, gripping the wrench tightly. "We fight or we die." Nathan tightened his grip on the wrench as the creature advanced, its grotesque form towering over them in the dim light. The cavernous room seemed to amplify every sound, from the heavy thud of the creature's footsteps to Lisa's rapid, panicked breathing. Shadows danced on the walls, giving the illusion that the room itself was alive, twisting and writhing with malice. "We can't fight it here," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the creature's low growl. "We have to get out." "How?" Nathan shot back, his eyes darting around the room. The tunnel they had come through was too narrow to navigate quickly, and the creature blocked the only other visible exit, a massive iron-bound door at the far end of the room. It loomed ominously, half hidden in shadow, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The creature lunged suddenly, its movements impossibly fast for its size. Nathan swung the wrench with all his strength, the metal connecting with the creature's arm in a sickening crunch. The force sent it stumbling backward, but only for a moment. It recovered quickly, its hollow eyes glowing brighter as it let out an ear-piercing screech. "Move!" Nathan shouted, grabbing Lisa's arm and pulling her toward the altar. They ducked behind it, just as the creature's claws raked through the air where they had been standing. The altar provided little cover, but it gave them a moment to think. Lisa's eyes were wide with fear as she clutched a rusted piece of metal she had picked up from the ground. "What do we do?" Nathan's mind raced. His flashlight beam swept across the room, landing briefly on the iron door. "We get to that door. It's our only chance." Lisa hesitated, her gaze flicking between the creature and the door. "What if it doesn't open?" "Then we're dead either way," Nathan replied grimly. The creature's screeches echoed through the room as it circled the altar, its claws scraping against the stone floor. Nathan motioned for Lisa to follow him, and the two began moving slowly, staying low to avoid drawing attention. The air was thick with the stench of decay, making it hard to breathe. As they crept toward the door, the creature suddenly turned, its glowing eyes locking onto them. With a guttural roar, it charged. Nathan shoved Lisa forward. "Run!" Lisa sprinted toward the door, her heart pounding as she reached it. Her hands scrambled over its surface, searching for a handle or latch. "It's locked!" she cried, panic rising in her voice. Nathan turned just in time to see the creature closing in. He swung the wrench again, aiming for its head, but this time the creature caught the weapon in its claws, snapping it in two with a deafening crack. Nathan stumbled backward, his eyes wide as the creature loomed over him. "Lisa, find something," he shouted, desperation in his voice. Lisa's fingers traced the strange symbols etched into the door. One of them felt different, a small indentation that gave way when she pressed it. The door groaned, its ancient mechanisms creaking as it began to swing open. "Nathan, come on," she screamed. Nathan didn't hesitate. He darted past the creature, narrowly avoiding its claws as it swiped at him. He dove through the opening just as Lisa pushed the door closed. The creature's roar echoed through the tunnel as the door slammed shut, sealing them inside. The new room was smaller, but no less unsettling. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange, ancient artifacts, twisted sculptures, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and books bound in what looked like leather, but felt far more sinister. A faint, otherworldly glow emanated from a pedestal in the center of the room, where a single object rested, a large black crystal that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Nathan's eyes were fixed on the crystal. "I don't know, but I think it's important. Maybe even the key to all of this." Lisa shook her head. "We need to find another way out. That thing, it's not going to stop." Nathan nodded, tearing his gaze away from the crystal. He began searching the room, running his hands along the walls for any sign of an exit. Lisa followed suit, her fingers trembling as they brushed against cold stone. The air in the room grew heavier, and a low hum filled the space. The crystal's glow intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Lisa turned to Nathan, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" Nathan nodded. "It's coming from the crystal." Before they could react, the door behind them shuddered, the creature's roars growing louder. The pounding began again, each impact shaking the room. Cracks formed along the walls, and dust rained down from the ceiling. "We don't have much time," Nathan said, his voice tense. "Help me move this." He gestured to a heavy bookshelf that was partially blocking another doorway. Together, they pushed it aside, revealing a narrow passageway that descended even deeper into the earth. The crystal's hum grew louder, almost deafening, as if protesting their departure. Nathan hesitated, his eyes lingering on the glowing object. "What if we need it?" Lisa grabbed his arm. "We don't have time. Let's go." Reluctantly, Nathan followed her into the passageway, the sound of the creature's pounding fading as they descended further into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the walls became rough and uneven, as if they were moving through a natural cave rather than a constructed tunnel. They emerged into another cavern, this one even larger than the last. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, glistening with moisture, and an underground river cut through the center of the room, its water glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, their meanings incomprehensible but deeply unsettling. Nathan and Lisa crossed the river on a narrow stone bridge, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. On the other side, they found another door, this one made of stone and covered in the same symbols as the previous one. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the door. "Do you think we're safe?" Nathan shook his head. "Not yet." As they pushed the door open, a new sound reached their ears, a deep, resonant chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but as they stepped inside, torches flared to life along the walls, revealing a massive, circular chamber. In the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. It held a staff topped with a crystal similar to the one they had left behind, and its presence radiated a chilling, oppressive power. "You should not have come here," the figure said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Nathan stepped forward, his fear giving way to anger. "What have you done to our friends?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "They are part of the cycle now, as you soon will be." Lisa grabbed Nathan's arm, pulling him back. "We have to go." The figure raised its staff, and the room began to tremble. The walls cracked, and the torches flickered wildly. From the shadows, more creatures emerged, their twisted forms illuminated in the flickering light. Nathan and Lisa exchanged a panicked glance before turning and sprinting back toward the door. The creatures gave chase, their guttural roars echoing through the chamber as the figure's chant grew louder. They barely made it back to the bridge when the ground beneath them began to shake violently. Stalactites fell from the ceiling, crashing into the river below. Nathan grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her forward as they ran for their lives. "Keep going!" he shouted. As they reached the far side of the cavern, the passage behind them collapsed, sealing the creatures inside. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. Nathan leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. We have to find a way out of here." Lisa nodded, her face pale but determined. "Let's keep moving." With no other choice, they pressed on, the oppressive darkness closing in around them as they ventured deeper into the unknown. The oppressive darkness surrounded them as they moved deeper into the unknown, each step echoing faintly in the cavernous passage. The walls were rough, cold, and damp, shimmering faintly with the moisture that trickled down in thin rivulets. Every sound, from the crunch of their footsteps on gravel to their ragged breathing, seemed amplified in the eerie silence. Lisa clutched Nathan's arm, her knuckles white. "Do you think they're still following us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathan shook his head, though his gaze remained fixed ahead. "I don't know, but we can't stop. Not until we're out of here." The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the ones before, but no less unsettling. The ceiling was high, disappearing into shadows, and the floor was uneven, scattered with broken stones and strange markings. The walls were adorned with symbols etched deeply into the stone, glowing faintly with an otherworldly blue light. The glow bathed the room in an ethereal hue, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, its surface worn and cracked, as if it had been there for centuries. Resting on it was an ornate dagger, its blade black and jagged, its hilt encrusted with dark red gems that seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. Lisa's breath hitched as she approached it. "What is this place?" she murmured, reaching out tentatively toward the dagger. Nathan grabbed her wrist, stopping her. "Don't touch it," he warned. "We don't know what it does." Lisa hesitated, her hand trembling. "Maybe it's a weapon. We need something to defend ourselves." Nathan glanced back toward the passage they had come through, his nerves fraying. The faint hum that had been present since they entered the cavern grew louder, reverberating through the room. It was as though the air itself was alive, vibrating with an unseen energy. "If we take it, there might be consequences," he said. "Look around. This isn't just a weapon. It's part of something bigger." Lisa pulled her hand back reluctantly. "Then what do we do? Just leave it here and hope for the best?" Before Nathan could respond, the chamber trembled violently, dust and small rocks falling from the ceiling. The hum intensified, and a deep, guttural growl echoed from the passage they had come from. Their pursuers were close. "Take it," Nathan said suddenly, his voice firm. "If it's a weapon, we might need it." Lisa grabbed the dagger, the gems on its hilt glowing brighter as her fingers closed around it. A wave of heat coursed through her arm, making her gasp, but she held on tightly. The moment she lifted it from the pedestal, the glow from the symbols on the walls intensified, and the hum reached a deafening pitch. The chamber shook again, and the passage behind them collapsed with a deafening roar, cutting off their escape route. Ahead, a new opening appeared in the wall, the stone crumbling away as if guided by an unseen force. "That's our way out," Nathan said, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her toward the opening. They ran, the glowing light of the symbols fading as they left the chamber. The new passage was narrower, the walls close enough to brush against their shoulders. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint sound of rushing water reached their ears. The passage opened onto a ledge overlooking an enormous underground lake. The water glowed faintly, illuminating the cavern with a soft blue light. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, and the sound of dripping water echoed endlessly. A narrow stone path wound its way along the edge of the lake, leading to another passage on the far side. Nathan stared in awe. This place, it's like something out of a nightmare. Lisa tightened her grip on the dagger. Whatever it is, we need to get out of here. Let's keep moving. They carefully navigated the narrow path, their footsteps echoing faintly in the vast cavern. The water below shimmered with an unnatural light, and strange shapes moved just beneath the surface, their forms indistinct but menacing. Lisa avoided looking down, her heart pounding with every step. Halfway across, a low growl echoed through the cavern, followed by the sound of claws scraping against stone. Nathan spun around, shining his flashlight back the way they had come. In the distance, shadows moved, and the unmistakable glow of the creature's eyes appeared, drawing closer. "They found us," he said, his voice tight with fear. Lisa turned, her grip tightening on the dagger. "We have to move faster." The creatures closed the distance quickly, their guttural growls echoing through the cavern. Nathan and Lisa broke into a run, the narrow path forcing them to stay close to the edge. Behind them, the creatures' glowing eyes grew brighter, their forms becoming clearer in the dim light. They were grotesque, their twisted bodies moving with an unnatural speed and agility. As they reached the far side of the lake, one of the creatures lunged, its claws scraping against the stone just inches from Nathan's ankle. He stumbled, but managed to keep his balance, pulling Lisa with him into the next passage. The path sloped upward, the air growing warmer as they ascended. The sound of the creatures faded, replaced by the steady rush of wind. Ahead, a faint light appeared, growing brighter as they approached. They emerged into the open air, the sudden brightness blinding after the darkness of the caverns. The wind was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a dense forest shrouded in mist. The sky above was overcast, the clouds swirling ominously. Lisa collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. Nathan leaned against a tree, his hands on his knees. "We made it," he said, though his voice was hollow. Lisa stared at the dagger in her hand, its gems still faintly glowing. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan looked out over the forest, his expression grim. "We keep moving. Whatever this place is, I don't think it's finished with us yet." The growls from the cave echoed faintly behind them, a chilling reminder that their escape was only temporary. Without another word, they descended into the misty forest, the dagger's glow lighting their path as the shadows closed in around them. The mountain air was crisp, each breath tinged with the earthy aroma of pine and moss. It was the kind of day that begged to be spent outdoors, and you answered its call with eager determination. Leaving the city at dawn, you'd driven for hours to reach this trail, a hidden gem tucked away in the vast wilderness. The world here felt untouched, as if civilization had never crept close enough to leave its scars. The trailhead greeted you with a wooden sign, weathered and moss-covered, its carved letters barely legible. The path beyond it was narrow, a single track meandering through a dense forest of towering evergreens. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy above, dappled patterns dancing across the forest floor. The earthy scent of pine mingled with the faint sweetness of wildflowers, and the occasional chirp of birds punctuated the tranquil silence. You'd packed light for this solo hike, a sturdy backpack with essentials, water, snacks, a map, and a compass. The solitude was a welcome reprieve. Life in the city had become suffocating, its endless noise and ceaseless demands grinding against your nerves. Out here, the world felt simpler, purer, and the only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of your boots on the dirt and the whisper of the breeze through the trees. As the hours slipped by, you fell into a meditative rhythm. The trail wove through groves of ancient trees, their gnarled roots protruding like veins from the earth. Occasionally, the forest opened to reveal breathtaking vistas, sweeping valleys blanketed in green, distant peaks kissed by clouds, and rivers that glinted like molten silver in the sunlight. You paused often to drink it all in, your lungs filling with the cool, clean air that seemed to rejuvenate your very soul. You passed a solitary deer grazing in a sunlit clearing. Its ears twitched as you approached, but it did not flee, merely watching you with wide, liquid eyes. For a moment, you felt like an intruder, a visitor in a world that belonged to creatures far older and wiser than yourself. The map marked this trail as an unfrequented route, and it was easy to see why. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, the path narrowing and twisting as it climbed. Jagged rocks jutted from the ground, and fallen trees formed natural obstacles. Yet the challenge exhilarated you. Each step felt like progress, a triumph over the mundane struggles that had plagued you back home. By mid-afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the trail. The temperature dropped slightly, and the forest took on a cooler, darker tone. It was then that you first noticed something unusual. The trail seemed to diverge ahead, splitting into two paths. The fork was not marked on your map, and the left path, the one you'd expected to follow, continued as described. The right path, however, was different. It was almost hidden, shrouded by overgrown vegetation and partially obscured by a fallen tree. The entrance was framed by two massive boulders, their surfaces covered in lichen and strange, spiral-like carvings. You knelt to examine them, tracing the patterns with your fingers. They felt deliberate, as if left by someone or something. Curiosity tugged at you. The path to the left was predictable, mapped, and safe. The right path, though, beckoned with an air of mystery. You hesitated, weighing your options. The sensible choice was clear, but you couldn't shake the pull of the unknown. Just for a little while, you muttered to yourself, stepping onto the overgrown path. The forest seemed to change as you pressed forward. The air grew denser, cooler. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and their branches intertwined to form a canopy so thick that only slivers of light broke through. Moss carpeted the ground, muffling your footsteps. Even the sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by a profound silence that pressed against your ears. You paused occasionally to check your compass, noting with some unease that the needle wavered slightly, as if confused. The trail was faint, almost non-existent in places, and you had to push through tangles of vines and brambles. Yet despite the challenges, something compelled you to continue. The world around you felt different. The air carried an almost electric charge, and the shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edges of your vision. Hours passed, the sun dipping lower in the sky. You began to wonder if you'd made a mistake, if the curiosity that had led you here would now lead you astray. The forest seemed endless, its ancient trees standing like sentinels, watching silently as you pressed on. Just as doubt began to take root, the trees thinned, and you emerged into a clearing. The sight before you stopped you in your tracks. Nestled in the valley below was a village, its rooftops a patchwork of thatched straw and weathered wood. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, and the faint sound of voices carried on the breeze. The scene was idyllic, almost too perfect, like a painting brought to life. Your pulse quickened. This village was not on your map, nor had you read or heard of any settlements in this area. It was as if the village had been hidden, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. From your vantage point, the place looked timeless, untouched by modernity. Yet, an unshakable feeling of unease settled over you, as though you were being watched. You scanned the clearing, your eyes drawn to the villagers moving about. They seemed normal enough at first glance. Men, women, and children engaged in the mundane tasks of daily life. Yet there was something off about them. It was subtle, but the longer you watched, the more apparent it became. Their movements were too fluid, too synchronized. And then you saw it. None of them cast shadows. You blinked, convinced your eyes were playing tricks on you. The sun was low but still bright, its golden rays spilling across the clearing. The villagers should have cast long, stretching shadows against the ground, but there was nothing. The grass beneath their feet remained bare, untouched by the light. A chill ran down your spine. You took a step back, the urge to retreat battling with the gnawing curiosity that had led you here. This village, these people, they weren't normal, and yet you couldn't bring yourself to turn away. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." But it was too late. The village had seen you, and there was no escaping its gaze. As you descended into the valley, the eerie perfection of the village became more apparent with every step. The houses were arranged in a meticulous pattern, their thatched roofs blending seamlessly with the landscape. The gardens were bursting with vibrant blooms, their colors so vivid they almost seemed unnatural. Yet, despite the idyllic setting, the oppressive silence remained. It wasn't the absence of sound. You could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional murmur of a villager, but rather the absence of life's chaotic, unplanned noise. Your boots crunched softly on the dirt path as you approached the first house. It was small and tidy, with flowers lining the windowsills. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She was middle-aged, with silver-streaked hair tied in a neat braid. Her face was serene, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes sparkled with an otherworldly light. She smiled at you, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome, traveler," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "You must be weary. Please join us." You hesitated, your instincts screaming at you to turn back. Yet her tone was disarming, and her words seemed to weave a strange spell around you. Before you could reply, she turned and gestured for you to follow her. Reluctantly, you did. The village square was bustling with activity. Villagers moved about with practiced ease, their movements graceful and precise. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the still air. Men carried baskets of produce, their faces blank yet purposeful. Everyone seemed engaged in some task, yet none of it felt real. It was as if you were watching a carefully orchestrated performance. You couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at you. The lack of shadows was unnerving, but there was something more, something you couldn't quite put into words. The villagers, their faces, their movements, seemed too perfect, too controlled. It was as if they were puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen hand. The woman led you to a long wooden table in the center of the square. It was laden with food, roasted meats, fresh bread, and an array of fruits and vegetables. The aroma was intoxicating, and your stomach growled in response. She gestured for you to sit, and as you did, the villagers gathered around, their expressions eerily welcoming. "You are our honored guest," the woman said, placing a plate before you. "Eat. You must be hungry after your journey." You glanced around, your unease growing. The villagers were watching you intently, their smiles unwavering. It felt like a trap, but the hunger gnawing at your insides made it hard to resist. Tentatively, you took a bite. The flavors exploded on your tongue, rich and unfamiliar. It was the best meal you'd ever tasted, yet it left a strange, metallic aftertaste. As you ate, you tried to make conversation. "This village, it's not on any maps. How long have you lived here?" The woman smiled, her eyes glinting with something you couldn't identify. "We've been here for generations. This is our sanctuary, a place untouched by the outside world." Her answer was vague, and when you pressed for more details, she deflected with practiced ease. "There will be time for questions later. For now, enjoy your meal." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the villagers began to light lanterns around the square. The flickering light cast strange, shifting patterns on the ground, but still, there were no shadows. Your unease grew with every passing moment, but exhaustion and the heavy meal weighed on you, dulling your senses. A young boy approached, his face cherubic and unnervingly flawless. He tugged at your sleeve, his wide eyes staring into yours. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. Before you could respond, the woman appeared, her smile sharper than before. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him away. "He's tired," she said smoothly. "Children say the strangest things when they're tired." Her grip on the boy's shoulder was firm, almost too firm, and he winced slightly. The exchange sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through you. Something was very wrong here, and you needed to find a way out. But as the lantern's light grew brighter, and the villagers' eyes seemed to glow in the darkening square, you realized that leaving might not be so simple. The village, it had seen you, claimed you, and it wasn't ready to let you go. The woman who had greeted you earlier now stood at the edge of the square, her hands clasped in front of her. She seemed to exude an air of quiet authority, and the villagers deferred to her in subtle ways. A bow of the head, a sidelong glance, a step back when she moved past. Her smile, warm and inviting, never faltered, though it felt more like a mask the longer you observed her. "You must rest," she said, stepping forward. Her voice carried a melodic quality, soothing yet commanding. "We've prepared a place for you. You'll find it comfortable." You hesitated, glancing back at the long table and the villagers still gathered around it. Their eyes followed you, their expressions unreadable. The unease that had been building within you since your arrival flared into full-blown dread, but you nodded nonetheless. The thought of wandering back into the dark forest seemed equally unappealing, if not more so. The woman led you through the village, her movements graceful and deliberate. The houses you passed were uniform in design, yet each bore unique details. A carefully arranged stack of firewood, a wooden carving perched above a doorway, a lattice of vines trailing across a wall. The lanterns lining the paths cast a soft golden glow, illuminating the cobblestone streets and the occasional villager who lingered in the shadows, watching silently as you passed. She brought you to a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was quaint, with ivy climbing its walls and flower boxes beneath the windows. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a cozy interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a bed with a thick patchwork quilt stood against one wall. The room was sparsely furnished but warm and inviting. "You'll be safe here," she said, stepping aside to let you enter. There was an odd emphasis on the word safe, as though it carried a weight you couldn't yet comprehend. "Rest well, traveler. Tomorrow we'll talk." Before you could respond, she closed the door softly behind you, leaving you alone. The firelight danced across the walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed oddly out of place in this village of shadowless inhabitants. Your own shadow stretched long and dark across the floor, a stark contrast to the light and warmth of the room. You set your backpack down near the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress. The quilt felt heavy and reassuring beneath your fingers, but the tension in your chest refused to ease. You couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching you, just out of sight. As exhaustion finally began to creep over you, you lay back and pulled the quilt up to your chin. The fire crackled softly, its warmth lulling you into a restless sleep. Your dreams were vivid and unsettling. You saw the villagers gathered in the square, their faces obscured by shadows that shouldn't exist. The green-eyed woman stood at the center, her gaze piercing through the darkness. Around her, figures shifted and swirled, their forms indistinct but menacing. They moved closer, their whispers filling your ears with words you couldn't understand. You woke with a start, your heart pounding. The room was dark, the fire reduced to embers. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting a pale glow across the floor. You sat up, your breath hitching as you noticed it. Your shadow, stark and clear in the moonlight, stretched across the room. It wasn't alone. A second shadow, long and sinuous, flickered at the edge of the room. It moved unnaturally, sliding along the walls and floor without regard for the light source. You froze, your mind racing to make sense of what you were seeing. The shadow stopped, coiling like a serpent before retreating into the corner, where it disappeared entirely. You stumbled out of bed, your legs trembling. The room felt colder now, the warmth of the fire a distant memory. Grabbing your backpack, you slung it over your shoulder and approached the door. The floorboards creaked under your weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As you reached for the doorknob, a whisper brushed against your ear. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it froze you in place. "Stay." You spun around, your eyes darting across the room. It was empty, save for the dying fire and the faint moonlight. The shadow hadn't returned, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Your hand tightened around the doorknob, and with a deep breath, you pulled the door open. The village was silent. The lanterns that had once bathed the streets in golden light were extinguished, leaving only the pale glow of the moon. The houses stood dark and still, their windows like empty eyes staring out at you. The air was heavy, pressing against your chest with an almost tangible weight. You stepped outside, the chill biting through your clothes. The cobblestone streets were slick with dew, and your footsteps echoed unnaturally as you made your way back toward the square. The village felt different now, its perfection tarnished by the creeping sense of dread that had been growing since your arrival. As you reached the square, you saw them. The villagers stood in a circle, their faces turned toward the sky. Their expressions were blank, their eyes unblinking. At the center of the circle stood the green-eyed woman, her hands raised as if in supplication. Above her, the air shimmered, distorted like heat waves rising from the ground. You froze, unsure of whether to approach or retreat. The shimmering grew more pronounced, and a low hum filled the air. It vibrated in your chest, setting your teeth on edge. The villagers began to move, their bodies swaying in unison as the hum grew louder. The green-eyed woman turned to you, her gaze locking onto yours. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made you step back. She extended a hand, her voice cutting through the hum like a blade. "Come," she said. "It's time." The village square came alive as twilight deepened, lanterns flickering to life one by one. Their soft, golden glow bathed the cobblestones in a surreal light, creating a patchwork of warmth that contrasted with the encroaching darkness. The long wooden table in the center of the square was laden with food that looked as though it had been prepared for a royal banquet. Platters of roasted meats, fresh loaves of bread, vibrant fruits, and steaming vegetables were arranged with a meticulous care that bordered on obsessive. You hesitated at the edge of the square, taking in the scene. The villagers bustled about, their movements graceful and precise. Yet, despite their smiles and laughter, something felt rehearsed, like an actor repeating lines they had spoken countless times before. It was unsettling, this uncanny perfection. The green-eyed woman approached, her presence commanding yet oddly soothing. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her gaze held yours with a quiet intensity. "Come," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "You must be hungry after your journey." Before you could protest, she gestured toward the head of the table where an empty seat awaited you. The villagers turned their attention to you, their expressions welcoming but oddly expectant. The weight of their collective gaze pressed down on you, leaving you little choice but to comply. The chair creaked as you sat, its wood polished to a shine that hinted at age and careful upkeep. The green-eyed woman took a seat opposite you, her movements fluid and deliberate. Around the table, the villagers settled into their places, their faces alight with what seemed to be genuine anticipation. Yet, the absence of shadows remained a glaring anomaly. Even in the soft lantern light, their feet, hands, and bodies cast no trace of darkness on the ground. A young girl, no older than 7, stepped forward carrying a pitcher of what appeared to be wine. Her features were delicate, almost doll-like, and her large, unblinking eyes shimmered with the same peculiar light that seemed to animate all the villagers. She poured the liquid into your goblet with practiced ease, not spilling a single drop. "Drink," the green-eyed woman urged, her tone gentle but firm. "It will help you relax." You lifted the goblet cautiously, its surface cool against your palm. The wine, if that's what it was, held an iridescent sheen, its color shifting subtly under the lantern light. You took a small sip, the flavor rich and complex, with a faint metallic tang that lingered on your tongue. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unlike anything you had tasted before. As you set the goblet down, the villagers began to eat, their movements synchronized in a way that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. You hesitated, your appetite dulled by the unease gnawing at the edges of your mind. The green-eyed woman, noticing your reluctance, leaned forward slightly. "You must eat," she said, her voice low and soothing. "Our food is a gift, a token of our gratitude for your visit." Your stomach, betraying your nerves, growled audibly. The aroma of the feast was intoxicating, and despite your apprehension, you reached for a slice of bread. Its crust was crisp, the interior warm and soft. The first bite sent a wave of comfort through you, momentarily quieting your unease. The meal unfolded in a surreal harmony. The villagers chatted softly among themselves, their voices blending into a soothing hum. Yet, there was a peculiar lack of individuality to their conversations, as if each person's words were part of a larger, collective script. You couldn't shake the feeling that the meal was more than a simple gathering. It felt ritualistic, purposeful. As the meal progressed, the green-eyed woman addressed you directly, her tone conversational but probing. "What brings you to our village, traveler? This is a place few ever find." You hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I was hiking," you said carefully. "I came across a path that led me here. It wasn't on my map." Her eyes flickered with a hint of curiosity, or perhaps something deeper. "Many paths lead to places unseen," she said cryptically, "and some paths are not meant to be found." Her words sent a shiver down your spine, but before you could respond, she changed the subject. "Tell me, do you enjoy the solitude of the forest, or do you find it lonely?" The question caught you off guard. "I enjoy the quiet," you said slowly. "It helps me think." "Ah," she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "A seeker, then. The forest has a way of revealing truths to those who listen." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Around the table, the villagers had grown quieter, their attention subtly shifting toward your conversation. It was as if the entire meal had been orchestrated to bring you to this moment. The green-eyed woman leaned closer, her gaze locking onto yours. "You are special," she said softly. "The forest brought you to us for a reason. Do you know why?" Your pulse quickened. "No," you said, your voice barely above a whisper. "I don't." Her smile widened, and for a brief moment, her eyes seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. "You will," she said, "in time." The meal ended as abruptly as it had begun. The villagers rose from their seats in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. Plates and utensils were cleared with mechanical efficiency, and the square was soon empty, save for you and the green-eyed woman. "Come," she said, rising gracefully. "You must be tired. We've prepared a place for you to rest." You followed her through the now deserted village, the lanterns casting their soft glow on the cobblestones. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind. The house she led you to was small but inviting, its windows glowing with the warm light of a fire within. As she opened the door, she turned to you, her expression unreadable. "Rest well, traveler," she said. "Tomorrow, We will speak of many things." With that, she left you alone. The interior of the house was simple yet comfortable, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. You sat on the edge of the bed, your mind racing. The meal, the villagers, the green-eyed woman. None of it made sense. And yet, you couldn't deny the strange pull this place had on you. As you lay down, exhaustion finally overtaking you, one thought lingered in your mind. You had entered this village as a stranger, but it was becoming increasingly clear that you might never leave it the same. The first thing you noticed when you woke was the oppressive silence. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room cloaked in dim, flickering shadows. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint, earthy scent of the forest that surrounded the village. You sat up slowly, the weight of exhaustion still clinging to your limbs. Your eyes were drawn to the floor, where your shadow stretched across the wooden planks, distorted by the uneven glow of the dying fire. It was a simple, familiar sight, and yet, in this place, it felt like an anomaly. The villagers, for all their warmth and hospitality, had been utterly devoid of shadows. The memory of it sent a shiver down your spine. A faint creak interrupted your thoughts, the sound coming from somewhere beyond the walls of the cottage. You froze, straining to hear. The village had been silent when you entered the house, its lanterns extinguished and its streets deserted. Now, the faintest rustle reached your ears, followed by the soft patter of footsteps. You rose cautiously, your movements slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked beneath your weight, their groan amplified in the stillness. You crossed the room to the window, peering through the frosted glass. The village was cloaked in shadow, the moonlight casting pale beams over the cobblestones. At first, you saw nothing. Then, movement caught your eye. A figure stood at the edge of the square, their form half shrouded in darkness. They were tall and thin, their posture unnaturally rigid. For a moment, you thought it might be one of the villagers, but something about the figure's stillness felt wrong. They didn't move, didn't shift, or breathe. They simply stood there, their head tilted slightly as if listening. The whisper came suddenly, faint and ghostly, brushing against your ear like a breath of cold air. "Leave." You spun around, heart pounding. The room was empty, the door still closed. The whisper had been so close, so real, that you half expected to see someone standing behind you. But there was nothing, only the faint crackle of the embers and the distant rustle of leaves. Your shadow shifted, stretching unnaturally across the room, as if pulled by an unseen force. You watched in growing horror as it twisted and writhed, detaching itself from your movements. It crept toward the walls, dark tendrils reaching for the corners of the room. "Leave," the whisper came again, louder this time. The voice was urgent, almost pleading. You grabbed your backpack, slinging it over your shoulder as adrenaline surged through your veins. The door opened with a groan, and you stepped out into the night. The cool air hit your face, sharpening your senses. The village was eerily quiet, the cobblestones slick with dew. The figure you'd seen earlier was gone, but the oppressive weight of being watched remained. The lanterns lining the streets were extinguished, their iron frames casting faint silhouettes against the moonlit ground. You moved cautiously, your footsteps muffled by the thick air. Every shadow seemed to shift and twist at the edge of your vision. and the feeling of being followed grew stronger with each step. As you reached the village square, you froze. The green-eyed woman stood in the center, her back to you. She was motionless, her hands clasped in front of her. The air around her shimmered faintly, as though the light itself bent to avoid her. Slowly, she turned to face you, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be out," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of warning. "The night is not safe for those who don't understand it." Your shadow quivered beneath you, flickering like a candle caught in a gust of wind. You took a step back, your instincts screaming at you to run. "What is this place?" you demanded. "What's happening to me?" She tilted her head, her green eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You carry something precious," she said. "Something we need." Her words sent a chill through you, and you glanced down at your shadow. It stretched unnaturally across the ground, its edges fraying like fabric unraveling. The villagers had no shadows, and now yours seemed to be slipping away. "I don't understand," you said, your voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The green-eyed woman took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your shadow is not just a part of you," she said. "It is a tether, a connection to the world you came from. Here, in this place, shadows hold a different meaning. They are life. They are light. Without them, we are less." The villagers began to emerge from the shadows, their faces pale and luminous in the moonlight. They moved silently, their steps in perfect unison. They formed a circle around you, their hollow eyes fixed on your trembling form. "We gave ours willingly," the woman continued, "to remain here, to survive. But the price, it grows heavier, and now you have brought something we cannot ignore." The circle tightened, and the air grew colder. Your shadow writhed on the ground, its form shrinking as if being drawn toward the villagers. Panic surged through you, and you took a step back, only to find your path blocked by their glowing, unshakable presence. "Stop," you said, your voice rising. "You can't take it." The green-eyed woman's gaze softened, but her expression was tinged with sadness. "It is not yours to keep," she said. "Not here." The circle closed in, and the shadows on the ground began to twist and merge, drawn toward the woman at the center. You felt a pull, a force that tugged at your very being, threatening to tear you apart. And then, a voice cut through the chaos. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Run!" You didn't hesitate. You turned and bolted, shoving past the villagers as the circle broke. Their hands reached for you, cold and unyielding, but you pushed forward, your heart pounding. The shadows writhed around you, reaching for your feet, your legs, your very soul. The path ahead was dark and winding, the village blurring into a haze of pale light and shifting shapes. The whispers grew louder, urging you on, guiding you through the labyrinthine streets. The green-eyed woman's voice echoed behind you, calm yet insistent. "You cannot escape, not without a price." But you didn't stop. You couldn't. The forest loomed ahead, its dark expanse offering the only promise of escape. You plunged into the trees, the shadows chasing you, their tendrils reaching but never quite catching hold. And as the village faded behind you, the whispers began to fade too, leaving only the sound of your ragged breaths and the pounding of your heart. But the feeling remained, the weight of eyes watching, of something left unfinished. and the faint, flickering presence of your shadow, still clinging to you, but only just. The villagers had retreated into the edges of the forest, their hollow eyes glinting like fading embers in the distance. But you knew they were still there, lingering in the periphery, waiting for you to falter. Your breath came in short gasps as you stumbled forward, your legs screaming with exhaustion. The forest seemed alive, the trees crowding closer together as if conspiring to keep you within. The air grew colder with every step, the chill cutting through your clothes and biting into your skin. Your shadow twisted and writhed beneath you, its movements no longer mirroring your own. It was as if it had gained a life of its own, struggling to break free from your tether. Ahead, a faint glow pierced the darkness. It flickered like a will-o'-the-wisp, beckoning you deeper into the forest. Desperation urged you forward. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the shadowless village that clung to you like a memory you couldn't shake. As you drew closer, the glow resolved into a clearing bathed in an ethereal light. The source was a tree unlike any you had ever seen. Its trunk was gnarled and ancient, its bark shimmering with a silvery sheen. The branches stretched upward like skeletal arms, their tips glowing with orbs of soft, golden light. The ground around the tree was covered in moss so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. You approached cautiously, your shadow stretching unnaturally long behind you. The air here felt different, charged with an energy that made your skin prickle. At the base of the tree sat a figure, their silhouette barely discernible against the glow. They were hunched over, their hands resting on their knees. As you stepped closer, the figure raised their head, and you were met with a pair of eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. The figure was gaunt, their features sharp and angular. Their skin had the pallor of someone who had not seen sunlight in years, and their hair hung in long, unkempt strands. Despite their frail appearance, there was an undeniable power about them, a presence that made you hesitate. "You've come far," the figure said, their voice a low rasp that seemed to resonate within your chest. "Farther than most." You swallowed hard, your throat dry. "What is this place?" you asked, your voice trembling. The figure's lips curled into a faint smile. "This is the threshold," they said, "the place where light and shadow converge. Few make it here, and fewer still leave unchanged." You glanced over your shoulder, half expecting to see the villagers emerging from the forest, their hollow eyes fixed on you. But the shadows behind you were still, the trees standing silent and watchful. "They won't follow," the figure said, as if reading your thoughts. "Not here. This place is beyond their reach." You exhaled shakily, relief mingling with a lingering unease. "Why are they after me?" you asked. "What do they want?" The figure's smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. "They seek what they have lost," they said. "Their shadows. Without them, they are hollow, mere echoes of what they once were. But you," they leaned forward, their dark eyes boring into yours. "You still have yours, and that makes you a beacon, a reminder of what they can never reclaim." You looked down at your shadow, which lay trembling at your feet. It seemed darker now, denser, as if it had absorbed some of the energy from the tree's glow. "Why is it changing?" you asked. The figure tilted their head, their gaze thoughtful. "Your shadow is tied to you," they said. "It reflects not just your form, but your essence. Here, in this place, it begins to take on a life of its own. The longer you remain, the stronger its pull will become. And if you're not careful, it will consume you. A chill ran through you. Consume me? The figure nodded slowly. Shadows are not meant to exist untethered. They crave light, just as light craves them. Here, at the threshold, that balance is fragile. If your shadow grows too strong, it will pull you into the void, and you will become one of them. You took a step back, your heart racing. How do I stop it? The figure's expression darkened. There is no easy answer, they said. But there is a choice. You can sever the bond, relinquish your shadow, and leave this place free of its burden. Or you can embrace it, accept its power, and risk losing yourself in the process. The weight of their words pressed down on you, the enormity of the decision threatening to crush you. What happens if I let it go? You asked. The figure's smile returned, faint and wistful. You will return to your world, they said, but you will be changed. A part of you will remain here, tied to this place. You may never feel whole again. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the glowing tree. You looked down at your shadow, which quivered as if sensing your hesitation. It was a part of you, as intrinsic as your heartbeat. Yet now it felt alien, a stranger bound to your feet. And if I embrace it? You asked, your voice barely above a whisper. The figure's gaze hardened. Then you will gain a power few can comprehend, they said. But it will come at a cost. The villagers will no longer haunt you, but the void will. You will be neither of your world nor of theirs, a wanderer caught between light and shadow. The choice hung before you, impossible and inevitable. The glow of the tree seemed to intensify, its light casting long, twisting shadows across the clearing. The figure watched you silently, their dark eyes unreadable. You took a deep breath, the weight of your shadow anchoring you to the ground. Whatever you decided, there would be no turning back. The forest swallowed you whole as you turned away from the tree and its enigmatic guardian. The air grew heavier, thick with an otherworldly tension, and each step felt like a laborious plunge into the unknown. The figure's words echoed in your mind. You cannot escape without a price. Yet you pushed forward, driven by a desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay freedom from this strange and oppressive place. The shadows around you thickened, no longer content to linger at the edges of your vision. They writhed and twisted, forming tendrils that reached for you, brushing against your arms and legs like cold, clammy fingers. Your shadow, now entirely untethered from your movements, slid ahead of you, a dark specter leading the way. You tried to avoid looking at it, but its movements were impossible to ignore. It darted between the trees, its form shifting and expanding, mimicking shapes both human and inhuman. It was as though it were testing its boundaries, reveling in its newfound freedom. Despite the fear gnawing in your stomach, you couldn't help but wonder, was it guiding you or leading you deeper into danger? The forest's oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of your ragged breaths and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The faint glow of the tree had long since disappeared, and the only light came from the pale moon overhead, its beams fragmented by the canopy of gnarled branches. The path was uneven, roots jutting out like claws to trip you, yet you pressed on, unwilling to stop. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, a chorus of hushed voices that seemed to emanate from the very air around you. They spoke in a language you couldn't understand, their tones alternating between pleading and mocking. The sound burrowed into your mind, growing louder with each step, until it felt like the whispers were coming from inside your head. "Turn back," one voice hissed, sharp and venomous. "Come closer," another purred, seductive and honeyed. You pressed your hands to your ears, but it was no use. The whispers weren't external. They were inside you, weaving through your thoughts like invasive roots. The sensation made your skin crawl, but you kept moving, refusing to give in to the fear. The trees began to change, their trunks twisting into grotesque shapes. Faces seemed to emerge from the bark, contorted, screaming visages frozen in expressions of agony. Their eyes, hollow and empty, seemed to follow you as you passed. The ground beneath your feet grew softer, almost spongy, and a faint mist began to rise, curling around your ankles like a living thing. Ahead, the shadows converged, forming a dense, impenetrable wall that stretched as far as you could see. Your shadow paused at its edge, shivering like a living creature, before slipping into the darkness and vanishing from sight. You hesitated, your heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at you to turn back, to flee. But where could you go? The villagers, the green-eyed woman, the void, they were all behind you, waiting for you to falter. Taking a deep breath, you stepped into the shadow. The world changed in an instant. The air grew colder, biting at your skin, and the ground beneath your feet felt insubstantial, as though you were walking on a surface that wasn't entirely solid. The darkness was absolute, pressing against you like a living thing. Yet you could see, or perhaps sense, faint shapes moving within it. Figures emerged from the blackness, their forms indistinct and flickering, as though they were caught between existence and non-existence. They surrounded you, their faces shifting and blurred. Some appeared human, while others bore features that were grotesque and alien. Their eyes, or what passed for eyes, glimmered faintly, like distant stars. "Who are you?" you asked, your voice trembling. The figures did not answer. Instead, they moved closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. You tried to back away, but the ground seemed to shift beneath you, pulling you toward them. One figure reached out, its hand, or what remained of it, brushing against your arm. The touch sent a jolt of icy pain through your body, and you cried out, stumbling backward. "You don't belong here," a voice whispered, its tone mournful. "But neither do we." Another figure stepped forward, its face coming into focus. It was familiar, terrifyingly so. It was your own face, twisted and hollow, with eyes that burned like dying embers. The sight made your stomach churn, and you averted your gaze, only for another figure to take its place, bearing the visage of someone you thought you had forgotten. "Why have you come?" the figure asked, its voice a perfect echo of your own. You swallowed hard, your throat dry. "I didn't mean to," you said. "I was just lost." The figures exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then, as one, they raised their hands, pointing toward something in the distance. You turned, following their gestures, and saw a faint light flickering far ahead. It was dim and fragile, but it was the only beacon in the oppressive darkness. "Go," the voices said in unison, "before it's too late." You didn't wait to be told twice. You ran, the shadows parting before you like a living tide. The light grew brighter as you approached, its warmth cutting through the cold like a knife. The whispers faded. replaced by the steady thrum of your heartbeat in your ears. When you reached the light, you stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath. The clearing was small and enclosed, its perimeter marked by stones that glowed faintly with an inner light. At its center stood a figure cloaked in white, their face obscured by a hood. They turned as you entered, their movements slow and deliberate. "You've made it," the figure said, their voice calm and measured. "But the journey is not over." You dropped to your knees, exhaustion overtaking you. "What do you want from me?" you asked, your voice breaking. The figure approached, their presence both comforting and imposing. "It is not what we want," they said, "but what you are willing to give." The figure in white stepped closer, the faint glow from the stones outlining the edges of their flowing cloak. Their hood obscured their face, but their presence carried a weight that pressed against your chest. The clearing was silent except for the faint hum of energy that emanated from the perimeter stones. "You've come far," the figure said, their voice calm yet heavy with purpose. "Farther than most, but the journey ends here." You staggered to your feet, every muscle in your body protesting. "I don't understand," you said, your voice hoarse. "What is this place? Why was I brought here?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as though contemplating your questions. "You were brought here because you were chosen," they said. "Not by us, but by the balance itself. You carry something rare, something precious. And now, you must decide its fate." A chill ran through you. "My shadow," you whispered, the realization dawning. "You want my shadow." The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they gestured to the glowing stones surrounding the clearing. "Look around you," they said. "This is the threshold, the place where light and shadow meet. It is a sanctuary, but also a crucible. Here, the balance is held, and here, choices are made." You turned, your gaze sweeping across the clearing. The stones pulsed faintly, their light ebbing and flowing like a heartbeat. Beyond them, the darkness writhed, alive with shapes that flickered in and out of existence. Your shadow quivered beneath you, its edges fraying and stretching as if pulled by unseen forces. "What happens if I give it to you?" you asked, your voice trembling. The figure's tone softened, almost compassionate. "If you relinquish your shadow, it will join the others, becoming part of the balance. You will leave this place unburdened, free to return to your world. But you will be changed. Without a shadow, you will be incomplete, untethered. You will walk in the light, but the void will always linger at your edges." "And if I keep it?" you pressed, dread curling in your stomach. The figure's posture stiffened. "If you choose to keep your shadow, it will grow stronger. It will become a part of you in ways you cannot yet comprehend. But the void will not forgive your defiance. You will be marked, hunted. The villagers you saw, they are only the beginning. The void will take its due, one way or another." The weight of the decision settled over you, suffocating in its enormity. You looked down at your shadow, which trembled as if sensing your thoughts. It had been with you your entire life, a constant companion, an unspoken part of who you were. To lose it felt like losing a piece of your soul. Yet, to keep it meant inviting unimaginable horrors into your life. "Why me?" you asked, desperation creeping into your voice. "Why was I chosen?" The figure took another step closer, their voice low and resonant. The balance does not choose lightly. You were brought here because you carry the strength to decide. Your journey, your trials, they have prepared you for this moment. Now, you must choose. Your breath came in shallow gasps, your mind racing. The whispers from the forest still echoed faintly in your thoughts, a chorus of pleading and accusation. The faces of the villagers flashed before your eyes, their hollow gazes a warning of what you could become. And yet, the memory of your shadow's defiance, its life, its will, burned within you. "I can't do this," you whispered, tears stinging your eyes. "I don't know how." The figure reached out, their hand emerging from the folds of their cloak. Their fingers were long and pale, their touch impossibly gentle as they rested their hand on your shoulder. "You are stronger than you know," they said. "The balance chose you because it believes in you. Now, you must believe in yourself." For a moment, the clearing seemed to blur, the glowing stones and writhing shadows blending into a kaleidoscope of light and dark. Your shadow flickered, stretching toward the edge of the clearing as if yearning for freedom. The figure's presence anchored you, their calm a beacon in the chaos. You closed your eyes, inhaling deeply. The choice was yours, and yours alone. With trembling hands, you reached down, your fingers brushing against the edge of your shadow. It quivered under your touch, its form shifting as though it were alive. The connection was electric, a surge of emotion and memory flooding through you. You saw flashes of your life, moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and regret, all etched into the fabric of your shadow. "I'll keep it," you said, your voice trembling. "It's mine." The figure withdrew their hand, their posture stiff. "So be it," they said. "But know this, the path you have chosen is fraught with danger. The void will come for you, and it will not stop until it has what it seeks." As the stones around the clearing dimmed, you felt a sharp pull at your feet. Looking down, you saw your shadow shifting unnaturally, its form solidifying and then breaking apart. It writhed like a living creature, its edges fraying into tendrils that curled around your ankles. The figure stepped back, fading into the darkness. The void's whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Shapes began to emerge from the trees, figures with hollow eyes and outstretched hands. They moved toward you, slow and deliberate, their voices a cacophony of hunger and despair. You turned and ran, the clearing dissolving into chaos. The forest twisted around you, its trees elongating and closing in like a cage. The whispers grew deafening, and your shadow surged ahead, pulling you toward the unknown. But no matter how fast you ran, the void was faster. A cold hand grasped your shoulder, and you stumbled. When you turned, you were face to face with one of the shadowless villagers, their mouth opening in a silent scream. They pulled at your shadow, their hands sinking into its dark form. Pain shot through you, a searing agony that left you gasping. One by one, more villagers joined, their hollow gazes locked onto you as they tore pieces of your shadow away. You screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The last thing you saw before the darkness consumed you was your shadow, fracturing into 1,000 shards as the balance claimed its due. And then, silence. You awoke in the forest, the sun shining brightly overhead. The village was gone, and the air was calm. But when you looked down, you saw no shadow beneath you, only emptiness. The whispers began anew, faint but unmistakable, and you knew the void would never let you go.